Kia ora everyone. So for the next few minutes, Danny and I are going to talk a little bit about one of the three factors that David mentioned this morning had a huge impact on whether or not people vote, and that is the effective income. So, one thing we know is that turnout in New Zealand has been declining. It's the reason we're all here. In the 1984 general election, just over 90% of the eligible population voted, compared with less than 75% in the most recent general election. However, another thing we know is that co-occurring with this, the level of inequality within New Zealand society has been increasing. The Gini Coefficient is a measure of income distribution commonly used as an indicator of inequality. It ranges on a scale from 0 to 1, where 0 means perfect equality and 1 indicates extreme inequality. And as shown here, the Gini Coefficient for New Zealand has been increasing since 1984. Inequality can be considered in two ways. Objective inequality represents actual discrepancies in economic advantage, while subjective inequality reflects how vast a person perceives the distinction between their own circumstances and those of others to be. So evidence suggests that objective inequality, as measured by the Gini Coefficient, can also be used as a functional proxy for subjective inequality. And as such, it is likely that as objective inequality increased in New Zealand, subjective inequality increased in tandem. Societal inequality is associated with a diverse array of negative outcomes, including declines in civic participation. Therefore, it is worth considering that it may also impact on the rate of voter turnout. It is noteworthy that negative outcomes associated with inequality are found even after controlling for people's income. Income, of course, is an objective measure of inequality and is reliably shown to be predictive of whether or not people vote. However, voting itself is an inexpensive action, so why should income be associated with voter participation? It may be that income impacts on voter turnout through psychological processes related to people's perceptions of their status in society rather than their absolute income. In psychology, this feeling of subjective inequality is called relative deprivation and describes the degree of dissatisfaction felt when comparing the circumstances of oneself or one's group to the circumstances of others. Critically, there are two types of relative deprivation: individual, which reflects personal comparisons between the self and others, and group, which reflects how disadvantaged a person perceives their ethnic group to be compared to other ethnic groups in society. Emotional and behavioural responses to relative deprivation are varied, with evidence to suggest that accompanying emotions of fear or sadness in response to perceived circumstances can prompt passive coping strategies such as neglect or avoidance, which, in the political domain, would likely manifest as abstaining from voting. We therefore hypothesise that relative deprivation may act as an underlying psychological mechanism which will partially explain why people's objective economic disadvantage impacts on their participation or abstention from the voting process. We tested this using data from the 2011 wave of the New Zealand Attitudes and Values Study. The NZAVS is a nationally representative longitudinal survey begun in 2009 which assesses a wide range of social attitudes and outcomes, and our analysis included nearly 5,000 of its participants. Shown here is a breakdown of the sample we used by demographics. In addition to these, our analysis included an assessment of voting behaviour and measures of relative deprivation, and Danny will now share the results with you.
I apologize, the next couple slides are going to be pretty data heavy, so please bear with me. But basically the most important thing to note from here, that was actually supposed to show up after, so apologize about that. But the most important thing to note on this slide is the right-hand column indicating the odds ratio, or the likelihood that participants will vote. And as you can see, we have a bunch of different demographic variables included in our set of analyses. And none of the slides are actually going to work. Well, as you can see from the slide up here, income was associated with a decrease in the likelihood that participants would vote. In fact, comparing the individuals who are wealthiest within the sample with those who are poorest within the sample, there's about a 10 times of a difference in terms of the likelihood of turning out to vote. So if you're wealthy, you're about 10 times more likely to vote than if you're poor in our sample. What's particularly important about this particular figure is the impact that people's perceptions of differences between their personal status and others within New Zealand, as well as their group status relative to other groups within New Zealand, had independent effects on the likelihood of voter turnout. Specifically, individuals who felt that they were relatively deprived relative to other individuals within New Zealand were half as likely to vote as individuals who didn't share this perception. Likewise, we see that individuals who perceive that their ethnic groups are relatively deprived in comparison to other groups within New Zealand were about 40% less likely to vote than individuals who didn't share this perception. So it really suggests that what's happening here is income is affecting people's likelihood of voting through these perceptions of status differences, both status differences between myself and others, as well as status differences between my group and other groups. So it's really suggesting that some important psychological factors are leading to a suppression of voter turnout within the New Zealand electorate. Just sort of wrapping things up, we know that voter turnout is experiencing a dramatic decline over the last 30 years or so. What our data tend to suggest, however, is that what's really driving some of these effects is the social comparison processes. So the extent to which individuals are making comparisons between themselves and others in New Zealand, as well as making comparisons between their group and other groups within New Zealand. Some of the interesting non-findings, and there were a lot of tears shed over this. As a psychologist, we were really thinking, it's all going to be about personality. Personality is going to predict voter turnout. Turns out it has no effect on anything. So quite a humbling experience for a psychologist in the room. You can talk to us afterwards. We'll be crying in the corner probably. But at that point, I'd just like to stop and thank you all for listening. Thanks.